there has been some activity in Serbia's Kosovo region. There's been protest demonstrations after a municipal election where Serbian people are claiming it's completely bunk, 4% turnout. And of course, Serbia's political class, their officials have been saying for quite some time that Kosovo's leadership has been wanting the Zelensky treatment. And so could you comment on what's happening there? There is a long history with NATO and Serbia, of course, dating back to the former Yugoslavia. And while I don't think anyone died in what was a pretty intense clash between NATO occupation troops, Kosovo forces, and Serbian people, and so I'm wondering, what's your impression of this? Your reactions? Whoever wants to begin, maybe Brian, if you want to begin.
Yeah, Brian.
The Duran actually did a really good job covering the situation in Serbia and explaining the whole background. The point that I want to make is that Kosovo, under international law, is recognized as part of Serbia, and yet the U.S., the rest of NATO, are playing this game where they're encouraging separatism, all while at the same time wringing their hands about Russia violating Ukraine's sovereignty. And then also we can talk about Taiwan, a province of China recognized as such by the UN, by the U.S. State Department officially on its website right now, and yet at the same time treating it like it's a separate country. This completely undermines the West's entire argument about upholding the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, which, by the way, since 2014 hasn't had any sovereignty. The elected government was thrown out of power by a U.S.-sponsored coup. So it's just another example of how the West is undoing its own legitimacy. And I think that's because the window of opportunity for it to assert itself as a global hegemon, that window has closed. They're still trying to encircle and contain both Russia and China at the same time. And when you're rushing, you're out of options. These are the kind of things that happen. All of these contradictions that make no sense and only end up undermining your credibility, which I think at this point the West has none.
Indeed, Putin's used the Kosovo example in his speeches and arguments. How the West will recognize Kosovo, but they won't recognize the autonomous regions in the Donbass as well. The double standards just keep going on there. We've seen unsuccessful attempts, I believe, personally, to open a second front in other countries. I think they even tried it in Georgia. They've tried it elsewhere. And now Kosovo is like this old scab that they're just picking at again, it appears, because of the leadership's reticence to toe the line. We've seen it both with Vucic and we've seen it with Orban as well. These leaders who have then been, well, yeah, I mean, it's oversimplified to say bullied, but it's far more complicated than that. And we're seeing almost that same bullying nature trying to be exerted on South Africa, among other nations as well. But specifically with these second fronts, yeah, I agree. I think, 14 Italians were injured in these conflicts with in Kosovo around Serbia and this. And I saw a report today about prayers for peace in Kosovo, and behind there you could hear gunfire and tear gas being deployed, and even it claimed artillery. I didn't hear artillery in that video, but this report said that. And once again, I feel sympathy for the people here being subjected to these geopolitical games being played by the West, and it only serves, as Brian says, to really show them for who they are and the game they're playing, which again, when the Russian media reports it, it just serves to strengthen the whole reason this special military operation, as they call it, is going on.
Yeah, and on Twitter, Kosovo's Serbia was trending, and it made me think that, well, NATO is not Serbia. Why? So Kosovo, yeah, attempted to break away. I think it was a little over a decade after the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, which kind of cemented the split of that country into many different pieces. But why is NATO still there? Like, why is NATO in Kosovo? And, earlier this spring, actual spring, not Ukraine's version of what spring is, but, earlier this spring, you had Vucic talk about possibly color revolutionary activity inside of the country, and he linked it to opposing sanctions, not going along with Western sanctions on Russia. I don't know if Brian, you wanted to comment first, and then.
Yeah, well, I just want to point out the Rand Corporation published that paper extending Russia. And this is one of the things they talked about, was creating all of these crises along Russia's periphery. Now that they're in this proxy war with Russia through Ukraine, it's exactly as Mike said. They're doing this to complicate matters for Russia as much as possible, and in an attempt to overextend Russia to get them to spread their resources thin. But I don't think that it's going to work. And at the end of the day, when they create these crises, if they want to actually reinforce what they're doing there, NATO has to invest. And what do they have left to invest? So it just seems like a very unsustainable strategy. But we've seen them do this, say, when the proxy war in Syria, the regime change operation in Syria. They did the exact same thing. They created crises all around Syria, inside of Syria, in Iraq, for example, the whole ISIS situation. And ultimately, it didn't change anything. It's it dragged the conflict out longer. But Syria, Russia, Iran, they understood what was going on and they paced themselves. And that's exactly what Russia is doing right now. It's pacing itself. People are wondering, where's the big arrow offensive? Why aren't they just sweeping across? Because they want to conserve their manpower and their equipment for various contingencies. And why, if you can do it slowly and time is in your favor, why speed it up and lose men and equipment unnecessarily? So I think this is, I don't know. I think you had another question, Danny. I'm not sure if I got it or not. There was another part to that question.
It's okay. Mike, have your comments, and we can circle back.
Yeah, Brian. Both Brian and I have covered that Rand report in previous videos that we've done of this trying to stretch Russia. Whereas I think, again, as Brian's just said, I think Russia's playing this long game because it serves its interests. And that's horrible to think about, actually, when you think about the blood cost involved. But the longer this pans out, the West is, first of all, destroying its own propaganda and narrative, as we've said, but also the economies. Now we've got the suspension of the debt ceiling, got all these things. It does seem to serve Russia's interests to pace itself, take its time. And that you can understand. But as I said, when you go to the front lines, you see, and you've seen some of the footage, as the people in the comments have seen as well, of the hell on earth that is resulting of it. I hope to go to Bakhmut in July to actually see for myself the devastation there, which even Zelensky himself compared to Hiroshima and all this. But they've played their part. And my main message is that I hope it's all over very soon. But in the geopolitical sphere, and we've even talked in a cold-blooded way about testing grounds and so forth, I think these psychopaths, certainly even the analysts at Rand as well, are quite happy with it. Lockheed Martin, I'm sure, Raytheon are also very happy about it. And I don't see any... It's actually from China that we've seen a peace plan. We've actually seen it from Lukashenko in Belarus. There are too few people, in my opinion, talking about a peace plan and an off-ramp for this. And when we come to NATO, I have to agree with Medvedev again about this idea that it's a defensive organization. I mean, that is laughable at this point, at any juncture. And then the talk that NATO is divided, I don't know that for a fact, but that's a common recurring allegation that's coming on. I have to agree with it. It seems to be a shambles, and it seems to be, well, the West always seems to be reactive. If from what I observe, especially with Joseph Borrell and von der Leyen, they just seem to throw money at the problem and think it's going to go away, and thinking they can't address the root causes. I really don't even want to entertain the idea of what they think the end result of all this will be.
And I think that's what makes the Serbia situation so interesting, to your point, Mike, is that it's laughable to call NATO a defensive organization when it's literally occupying Serbia and causing unrest in that country, given its role in supporting separatism in Kosovo, and not to mention its just absolutely horrific role in destroying that region, destroying the country that Serbia was once a part of, Yugoslavia.
Let's not forget Biden's comments about how proud he was about advocating to bomb Belgrade. I mean, that's a pretty viral clip. I hope most people watching are aware of that and how happy he was about it. And I'm not even talking about Lindsey Graham, talking about killing Russians is the best money we ever spent. Pfft, what an idiot.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. If people actually pay attention, if they ignore the polarism in American politics, and they actually look at foreign policy from one administration to the other, clear-headed of any sort of ideology, they will see that that is all the U.S. and NATO have done. It's an organization that implements military aggression around the world. They were in Libya. What does Libya have to do with defending Europe? It makes no sense. Afghanistan is in Central Asia. What did that have to do with defending Europe or the United States? Nothing, absolutely nothing. And then as time goes by, we look back at the pretexts used to justify these wars of aggression, and we can see just how flimsy or non-existent the pretexts were. And it's not a defensive organization. It is to implement hegemony around the globe. It is to encircle and contain Russia, and now they're setting up a liaison office in Japan because they want to branch out into Asia. I mean, it really is an evil organization trying to take over the world. And talking about Lindsey Graham and his sidekick John McCain there, for a while there, they would go to these different countries. They would associate with the absolute worst people in those societies. I'm talking about Al Qaeda, people associated with ISIS in Ukraine, actual armed Nazis. That's who they're going into these countries to assist, give weapons to, and unleash on the people. The local people, the neighboring countries have to deal with the fallout for all of these conflicts, wars and proxy wars. So no, NATO is not a defensive organization, and this is what Russia was faced with. A lot of people are still trying to question whether or not Russia had an alternative to launch the special military operation. Just look at what they did in Georgia from 2003. They overthrew the government there. They pumped it with weapons. They trained the troops. And in 2008, they attacked Russian forces. According to an EU investigation into the conflict, that was their conclusion, that it was Georgia that provoked that conflict. Then they did the exact same process from 2014 onward in Ukraine, only on a much, much larger scale, making it a much more serious threat to Russian national security. Also, they had Crimea. I mean, if you're going to make an argument for Kosovo, how can you make a different argument for Crimea, especially when a year beforehand, a U.S. government-funded poll found that people identified as Russian, and even before the Maidan, I think it was almost a quarter of them wanted to join the Russian Federation. That was before they had all of these additional reasons to do so. So it's just so obvious of what a threat NATO is. It's so obvious that Russia was acting in self-defense. They had already been attacked once. It wasn't as if we're not sure where this is leading. They knew absolutely where this was leading. So I mean, if you're going to talk about a preemptive war, this is you can definitely make a case here, whereas say in Iraq, no, you cannot.
I'd like to add, I was sent a message today saying that Zelensky had urged all countries bordering Russia to join NATO. Now, seemingly Zelensky failed to consider China and North Korea in that, but I haven't found that quote from Zelensky, so let's just call that an anecdote at this point.
It would not be out of character, though, certainly. He says a lot of things, and oftentimes they're a little incoherent, to say the least. But here's what you were talking about, Mike, what Joe Biden said about Belgrade and his involvement. So let's just listen. It's just 20 seconds, and we can kind of maybe end this topic here.
different. I just want to know what you suggest, because back then, when I was in your position, I was suggesting we bomb Belgrade. I was suggesting that we send American pilots in and blow up all the bridges on the Drina. I was suggesting we take out his oil supplies. I was suggesting very specific action. And isn't it interesting that we didn't?
So there you go. Joe Biden suggesting war crimes hard during the war on Yugoslavia. Reactions?
Cut from the same cloth as Lindsey Graham.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And imagine if Russian President Vladimir Putin was ranting and raving like that about wanting to blow up all the bridges, all the oil, everything in and across Ukraine. I mean, could you imagine what the reaction would be?
Waving his pen. I was suggesting we roll into Berlin and stay there and never give it up again. I was suggesting blitzing the rubbish out of Poland. Actually, on that note, though, I shared a clip on Telegram about Putin, in his own words. That's the Telegram channel, where Putin was questioned about this. Would you like to rule the entire world? You know, the West likes to say that Putin's going to conquer the whole world. That's his megalomaniac dream and ideal. Actually, he flippantly replied, of course. But then he followed it up more seriously and said, if you want to look to the people that do want to rule the world, the headquarters are not in Moscow, they're in Washington. And I think that is quite apparent, actually. Again, you can say, oh, that's just Russian propaganda. But all the evidence we've just discussed and the tactics that we've seen employed of late, and not just from Russia, and as I've touched on with South Africa complaining of EU and US State Department bullying, we've seen these panicked visits from US representatives to various countries, including India, as well, in reaction to certain events that play out. Blinken, some of his words as well. It's very clear and apparent. And with this idea of Taiwan, which I still can't wrap my head around the US thinking on that. I'm sure there's a RAND report that might be able to explain it.
Several.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. I really don't understand what the West is. When I was on the front lines, embedded with this unit, Veterani, I chatted with them for a few hours, and for the first couple of hours they were a bit standoffish of me due to my nationality, and they didn't know me from Adam. And I explained my story, and first of all they said that it was a big morale boost, that what I was doing and the work I was doing on YouTube, and they were like, thank you for that really helps us. But then they said, we think you're really brave for being here. And I couldn't accept that. I said, no, it's not bravery. And they said, well, what is it? Why are you here on the front lines under artillery shelling in a basement with us? And it's Solidar on the front lines. And I said, it's anger, actually. So I really had to wait a few seconds and sort of look inside myself and think, yeah, why am I here? I said, it's anger. I'm angry at the betrayal of my country. I'm angry at the betrayal of the memory of my grandfather and what he fought for. And perhaps that's not the best motivation, but I wonder if that explains also many other people in the West as well who are angry at the leaders, their words, their actions. People like Lindsey Graham, they don't represent me. I'm sure they don't represent the majority of the US people. And these guys, the DPR guys that are on the front lines, they understand that as well. They say, we know we aren't fighting the American people. We know we're fighting the American government, among others, even when we have these American munitions land on us. But we know who our enemy is, and we know the ideology that we're fighting as well. And remember, these people are on their homeland, so I'd invite also Americans to consider, if your homeland was threatened, what would you do? These guys are doing exactly the same.
Absolutely. And speaking of anger, I mean, that is what has always driven me, absolute outrage and anger about what is being done in my name by my government. And when you see in person the damage that is being done, I mean, I've seen the burned down sections of Bangkok, the US-backed mobs in 2010. I've seen the bombing in 2015 because Thailand sent these Uyghur terror suspects back to China after the US told them not to. I've seen that. It makes me angry, and that is what compels me. It's just absolute outrage at the injustice. And you talked about President Putin and referring to who's actually trying to rule the world. I mean, the 800 plus US bases around the globe, that is a little bit of a clue as to who wants to. And also the fact that if you look at US military command, the way they divide it, it's divided in sections of the planet rather than sections of the United States. Like Russia has its districts. China has its districts inside their territory. They don't have a command for out, like on the other side of the planet. The U.S. does. They have military areas around the entire planet. I mean, it's so obvious that this is the modern day empire of our times. And it's just amazing how they can convince people that it is. So many people are unaware that it is actually the empire of our time.
Yeah, the Indo-Pacific Command, these command structures you're talking about, Brian, it's huge. I mean, it dwarfs any other of the command structures that the U.S. has propagated. And I know you're in Thailand, so you know quite well the U.S.'s military footprint all across the Pacific. But anger, how could you not be angry? Because it doesn't benefit anyone. I mean, Mike, I know you're from the UK. I'm in the United States. It's like these countries are not getting any better. Things aren't getting better for people here, and yet you have massive investments. I mean, you can't even put into real thought, like how much money this is to then kill other people. I know, like, you've been in these war zones in the Donbass. I mean, these weapons that NATO is sending, the U.S. in particular, especially, they're killing people. They're killing innocent people that are just trying to live their lives and are trying to make a better life in the United States and its NATO. I don't know if you can call them partners, vassals. They are doing the opposite for their own gain, and that is infuriating. And so I think, I mean, it's very human. I think you're not really in touch with your humanity if you do not get angry at such a phenomenon. But it's really easy to get caught up in the misinformation web. But speaking of which, I wanted to.
It's not benefiting the people of Ukraine.
No.
When you ask what it's
as
for,
the economy, Ukraine's economy is destroyed. Absolutely
not. And if you want to talk, yeah, sure. I've been from the Russian side of things, but I've been in the military. I luckily wasn't in a contact situation. I wasn't in a war zone and wasn't deployed to any areas like that. Thank God. But my training was sufficiently good enough to understand that this is not Call of Duty. It's not glorious. It's hell. And I commented on another podcast the other day that one of the things that hit me when I was in my training was I grew up with big alls, and I grew up with Second World War and all this fight for king or queen of country, depends. Now it's just changed. But there was this bigger idea, for your country. Back even 2003, so, over 20 years ago in my case, back then it wasn't that, because we had the Iraq war going on, later to be Afghanistan, where I'd lose a few of my good friends. It was fighting for the man standing next to you. I did my minimum service. I got out due to the birth of my first daughter, and many of those guys came back and said, Jones, you were right to do what you did and get out whilst you could. And that was way back then. That was way back in Tony Blair, the war criminal that he is, never had an arrest warrant issued for his crimes. But despite all of that, being young, dumb, and full of spunk as we were, we still signed up, and we were going to do our duty, as it was still called back then. But I thought that was quite a telling shift. And with all of this and all these talk of Western values and democracy and all that, the cynical old soldier in me is just that absolute rubbish. And the devastation it's caused to not just areas like Bakhmut and all this, the actual human lives that are suffering because of it, for me is unforgivable. Certainly, as Brian said, not in my name.